Hello and welcome to session 7 of 7 for resilience. This is the final, which is a bit of a recap today. I'm going to go through what we've covered, do a bit of a recap, as I said, and cover a really important skill about moment-to-moment resilience, and also take any questions and answers. So we started about talking about levels of resilience, and someone's just said a minute ago that they might be feeling down the lower levels. And what we talked about is that really resilient people tend to learn from things. They tend to grow rather than bend or break. And or you talked about the notion of inviting adversity into your life. And it sounds like a strange concept, but anytime you've tried something new, taken on a new job, decided to have children, perhaps even getting married, you're trying on something beyond your normal skill set. And right at the top level as well, we also talked about really resilient people working on themselves rather than the situation or the survival. So moving from collapse through to self-actualize. So, and what this program is about is wherever you are to help you get better at getting further up. Why care about resilience? I popped up this slide from Harvard Business Review and also from Charles Darwin, that resilience essentially is about learning from something. It's about learning from adverse situations, and if you're able to learn from it, you can recover from it. And if you recover, then hopefully the next time it won't affect you as much. And then I popped up these definitions of resilience: ability to withstand pressure, able to thrive, getting better at change, and being able to adapt. But it's this one down in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the key to it, which is being able to thrive no matter what happens in life, and things will always get thrown at you. Then I gave some examples of how people respond when they faced with adversity. And if you can imagine, this is your normal level of functioning. And the first shock, in the case of a lockdown, this might have been the first lockdown and the second one. And some people's response will be a decline in normal level of functioning. And when we talk about function, I don't just mean I'm able to do the job, but maybe able to sort of deal with stresses at home, or able to function as a father or a mother, or able to function as a colleague. And that most people tend to sort of bounce back, but it can be a little bit rocky, and that the really resilient bounce back better than they were before. And this is where you want to get to, because you want to have, there'll always be adversities in life, and you want to make sure that when you face them the next time, you'll come out better than you were before. And I gave some examples of what I thought some figures were for that. And right down the bottom of what these people need when you've got PTSD, etc., is tools to cope with what's going on. You need to be able to cope with how you feel and what's happening. These are around better getting more about focus and performance and being able to return to your previous level of function. And right at the top, it's tools for learning. So it's about learning about the thing that happened. And so when you can think about adversity, I'm a bit of a slow learner myself. I need to go back many times and have the same lesson over and over before I learn. But the more resilient people get it quickly, and they get through this down the refractory period more quickly. So refractory period is that when you've got a big stressor, you decline for a while, and it's because you're trying to understand what happened to you. So with COVID and lockdowns or restructures, as some of you are going through at the moment, there's a dive for a while, and the dive happens because there's all of this new information, and a lot of it's threatening, and you're trying to understand it. There's a refractory period, and it's a dip. And this is this dip that you see here. And again, some of what being resilient is about is being able to reduce the refractory period, but also to get more out of it as you go up. And then I introduced this model, the resilience compass, and it has 6 aspects to it. Dealing with circumstances, so accepting them exactly as they are, having a belief that you'll get through it, you'll prevail somehow, turning to other people appropriately, friends and strangers, setting approach goals, so having a vision, having a direction that's an approach goal, making decisions for the greater good, so bringing people along with you when you make decisions about how you're going to recover, and going back afterwards and learning from it. And this is the one we covered one each week, plus some extra material, and last week we talked a lot about adversity. So I want to just go through them a little bit more, and then we'll come to catch up to where we are today. The first one around circumstances was accepting the circumstances exactly as they are. And I gave the example that you can't build a good house without having strong foundations. But there's some challenges in accepting the circumstances. They might be unpleasant, they might be uncomfortable, and sometimes they're truths that we don't want to face. And a lot of facing the circumstances around the situation we're in might feel truly awful, and you start telling yourself, I can't do this. And when you start to have that sort of language, then you might deceive yourself a little bit. That's a good word of good. Trick yourself a little bit. The second aspect, circumstances, is about accepting that sometimes it's very hard to accept your circumstances, and we may try to kind of make them better than they are in order to get through them. I've got a quote coming up about that in a moment. And I talked in that session that part of the hard thing was acknowledging your feelings. And I talked about the fact that the more nuanced you could acknowledge your feelings, the more descriptive you could be, the more you could identify them all, the more you're able to move through them. And I gave a couple of examples for instead of saying just anxious, being more detailed. Is it afraid or stressed, vulnerable or skeptical or worried or cautious? Similar of happy, thankful, trusting, content. You can see a bunch of other words there. And I gave the example of a study that was done with binge drinkers, and I gave them a number of different interventions, but one of the interventions was being able to identify their emotions really in a very nuanced way, and that helped you move through it. So that was part of the thing about circumstances, understanding where you feel. And then we moved on to self, and in self, the notion was, will you prevail? Do you have some sort of belief that no matter how this goes, that in the end you'll get through it somehow? And a strong sense of values often helps with that. And essentially what you want to think about is the problem that you're facing bigger than you, or are you bigger than it? And are you realistically, optimistically? So you want to believe that the problem's big, but somehow get through. So in a way, what happens in the first part is you turn and you face the issue full on and you completely accept it. Then you say to yourself, I know it's big and it's hard and it's difficult, but I will get through it. Even if I don't know how, I will get through it. It's kind of saying that you have yourself. And I talked about how it's important to not try to change the world to suit you, but to change yourself to suit the world. And, you know, there's lots of examples I gave, but there's 8 billion people in the world. They're going to have different ideas to you. And the less resilient are always trying to set up an environment that works. So I might have given my own example then that I've been in lots of relationships that haven't worked out, and I could find lots of reasons why there was something wrong with all of those partners, but there's a common denominator in it, and it's me. So at some point it's kind of useful to yourself to say, why do people respond this way to me? What is it about that I do that I bring to the world? Because the world tends to be stronger than you. So here's the quote I found this week, which kind of sums it up really, really well. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with a discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And that's the hard bit about it. Sometimes you've got to, it takes a lot of courage to go, I'm in a terrible situation. What will I do to get out of it? Because what's tempting to do is say, it's not that bad, really. John Stockdale is someone we've talked about a bit in this program. He was the Vietnam vet who got through, and he talked about, they asked him once, who survived for 7 years at the Hanoi Hilton, which was the Vietnamese prisoner of war camp that he was in. And he said, it's the ones that thought they would get out by Christmas. It's the ones that thought they would get out Christmas that gave up hope when it didn't happen. The guy who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, name escapes me at the moment, he was in the Auschwitz, in the concentration camps, and he talked about the ones who, you know, saved every scrap, realised they're in a really bad situation, saved every scrap of food and swapped the potato peel for a cigarette butt, which then got swapped for a piece of bread, etc., that got through. So you got to be brutally honest. And I know that when I was working at Gruen Biotics with our startup and things were not going well, that we had to sit down, and it was a big suck of breath to go, we are going to go out of business and lose everything unless we do some rapid changes around it. So similarly, if you're going through a restructure, and I'm not saying this is for any of you, there might be some point you look at it and you go, I'm a bit screwed here, I'm going to have to retrain, I'm going to do something else, the writing's on the wall. I've had that happen in a restructure as well. I mean, a restructure, it was with a business school, And they said, oh, we're going to go through a process, but I was one of the last on and one of the least experienced. I knew what was going to happen. It was going to be me, and it was. And I did go through a proper rational process, but I saved myself 2 months of time and got myself a laptop and business cards printed. So when it came, I was ready for it. So that's the difference between those two steps. You've got to absolutely accept that it's not a good situation. And once you do it, you turn away and you think about the fact that you will prevail. Talk to yourself about that. All right, and I also talked about values being values helping to be able to guide you here. And one of the things around values is it kind of it helps steady your course when things are not going well. So if you're sure of your own values and you behave in accordance with your values, then when people criticize you later for how it turned out, you can always come back and say, I acted with what I thought I could do with the information I had at the time. We also talked about the locus of control, and that was about having a proactive focus. And I said that there's two things that you can think about: your circle of concern or your circle of influence. And your circle of concern is always much bigger than your circle of influence. So we're all concerned about traffic and a clean planet and all of that sort of stuff. But what we can control is how we drive to work, or the fact that we use renewable energy. And so the more you focus on what is within your control, the more resilient you are, and the bigger that circle of concern gives you. And I gave the example of Gandhi, whose circle of influence was much bigger than his actual circle of influence is much bigger than his circle of concern. He could have influence over the whole of India, so it was trying to get independence from the British. So focusing on what is within your control, but also saying to yourself, how did I contribute to what is happening to me at the moment? We talked about friends and strangers, and do you see them as fellow travelers or enemies, and as or supporters and confidence? And one of the important things about friends and strangers is that one of the important things about friends and strangers is that by talking to people about what's going on for you, it helps you put things into context. And I talked a little bit about contextualizing things. You've got this big emotion going on. How do you digest the emotion? And one of the ways you can do that is by talking to people about it. All right, and then I gave the example of building self here. And the thing about building self was really around that the self-esteem movement has failed. It wasn't around telling yourself that you're great, but it was around telling yourself, it was around self-compassion and self-kindness. And I said that being self-compassionate, self-kind always beats self-esteem. And I said there are three parts to that. First of all, you need to be aware of what's going on. Then you need to accept it. And then you need to be kind about it. And we took you through a little self-compassion exercise. And I want to come back and stress that if you're going to take one thing from this program, it is being kind to yourself. And the reason for doing that is that it's hard enough to get through things that you screw up yourself or that go wrong in your life, and being unkind about it makes it harder. And that most people, most of the time, are doing the best they can with what they know and their experience and skills. So it's more important to say, oh, look, got it wrong, poor me, I did the best I could, that's okay, then I'm great and I'm terrific and I don't do anything badly. That's much more important. And there's absolutely no evidence for beating yourself up being a good way to change. No evidence at all. So go ahead and be kind to yourself, and it's the fastest way to improve anyway. Then we talked about direction, and this was very much about setting approach goals. So goals that you move towards. And we talked about lots of examples of people who are resilient. They have a great vision. We talked about some politicians and others, and you talked about some people that you knew personally. And having a vision, that's something that you move towards, tends to get you through for a couple of reasons. One is it's exciting and energizing, but the other one is that when you meet an obstacle on the way, if you have a vision, you won't just stop at the obstacle, you'll go around it and you'll continue to move. And I got you to set some goals that were approach goals rather than avoidance goals. You might remember avoidance goals are sort of things you're not going to do rather than things you're going to do. And I gave the example of I'm not going to smoke being an avoidance goal. It's a good one, but it's not. It's still an avoidance goals versus I'm going to have clean, clear lungs and live a healthy life. And that's much more motivating. And there's some evidence for how approach goals. This is avoidance goals. They don't work well in relationships as well. Then we talked about community, and I used the saying here. It was the Akram people of Africa, and the saying was that your neighbour's problems have arrived, yours will be here shortly. And how, as you're trying to leave the stressful, as you're trying to overcome the adversity, it's good to do so in a way that helps other people. I gave another example around people who've been injured in the workplace, and they've been injured in the workplace, and how they, justifiably feel angry with the workplace, but in trying to get over the injury, remembering that it's good for children to see working parents. So if they could recover from that and get back to the workplace, not for the workplace's sake, but to help their own community with their children. So trying to recover from things, and there's lots of other examples. Basically, if you help someone out when they're down, they're more likely to help you later. Common good versus self-preservation, or belonging or isolation are the key words there. And the last one was this one, which was the one about learning, which I think is, again, one of the keys. So do you see adversities as stumbling blocks or stepping stones? And we went through a little exercise there about helping you to recover. Won't cover it all now, but it was around imagining how else things might have gone. So imagining things turning out better, imagining a different pathway leading to the same outcome, imagining the same pathway into a different outcome, and imagining something worse. And that was around, because hindsight's a wonderful thing. When you go back later, you've often tried to do things as best you could in the circumstances. And that was the 6 domains, which is self, friends and strangers, direction, community, adversity. And then I talked about how it played out in real time. So you break your leg, you crash your car, your partner leaves you, there's a restructure at work. What we tend to do at first is go a little bit numb. And at that point, what you need to do is face reality as much as you can and understand the circumstances as deeply as you can. And what helps with that is some sense, once you do that, some sense that somehow you'll get through that. Then the event starts to stick in. You get your leg in a plaster cast, you can't drive your car because it's broken, you're living alone, or you're facing this restructure in the workplace and you might lose your job. And often at that point, you'll have strong feelings about that. And your job at this point is to try to digest the experience. Remember the refractory period? Remember, when you're facing an adversity, you actually can't take in new information. You can't. We talked about giving people time to get over that. And that's where you want to turn to friends and strangers for sort of emotional support, but also to digest that. Then it's time to respond. You want to take some action and you want to learn. And in responding, you want to think about, where do you want to be at the end of this? What's the bigger, longer term goal? And how can you do that preserves your community around you as well? Then once you've gotten through it, and only then, you want to bounce back, but you want to habitualize your new and better way of being. And that's when you go back and you look at the adversity and you say to yourself, what can I learn from this situation? What have I learned about how this is? So I want to give a little story here. And this is a photo I actually took traveling in Sri Lanka. And it's got some pluses and minuses about it as far as resilience. Anyway, I'm in Sri Lanka and I'm catching this train. This train's going to go over the longest trestle bridge in the world. And before the train took off, there's a lot of shunting up and down, and it's meant to leave at 9:30, and it doesn't leave at 9:30. It leaves at sort of 11, and the train's bouncing backwards and forwards. And these guys came onto the carriage, and they dropped these quite long pole devices in them, in the edge of the carriage. And I thought, oh, what are they for? Anyway, the train took off, and the infrastructure is a little bit run down. They had a civil war for 30 years. And we're riding along, and every now and then you'd hit this patch, and the whole train would just shake really hard. And so we just learned to ignore that, and it would be all right. And then we crossed this longest trestle bridge in the world, and shortly after we crossed the longest trestle trestle bridge in the world. There's this bit of shaking again, and your seat's falling back. But at this time, the conductor leapt up and grabbed the thing and smashed it down, and the carriage seemed to bounce and slide along the dirt for a while. Anyway, it turns out the carriage I was on had derailed. It had jumped off the tracks while I was on it. And we're like, oh, this is a disaster. And I'm thinking, well, that's it. That takes care of the trip. It's going to take at least 2 days till we get out of here, because, imagine that happening in Victoria. There'd be, in Australia, there'd be carriages, there'd be cranes coming and helicopter, news teams flying over, and people will be getting off with all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so we're sitting there for a couple of hours, and this kerfuffle kind of sort of starts. And then the next thing you know, because we're about half a mile from a station, half a kilometre, these people come running down, and they've got all sorts of stuff. They've got fish and twisties and card games and whiskey, and they've obviously been waiting at the station for us. And when they heard that the train had derailed, they came running down, and then so this whole thing sets up around the train, and you can get off the train, and you can chat and play some cards, get some food to eat, and some curries, and then these guys with really good safety gear, as you can see, come into the carriage and take up these things they dropped in, and take them and they stick them under the train, and they start jacking up the carriage. So this is a jack, and they're jacking up the carriage. I thought they were passengers, but clearly they must be working for the rail line. And what they do is they jack up the carriage, and then they get this long bamboo pole, and they bounce the train back onto the tracks. It takes about 2 hours, and then the train takes off. That was the end of the derailing. There was no phone call to the headquarters. There was no choppers. They didn't even tell us to get off the carriage while they were doing it. They stuck it back on. So, well prepared, and we're back on, and then we're back at the next station. We arrive at the destination in the afternoon instead of the morning. And I thought, wow, what do you think? Resilient? To actually put the jacks on it, they must have anticipated at some time the train may jump off the tracks. And when it does, we'll be ready for it. Now, I'm really glad it didn't jump off the tracks on the longest trestle bridge in the world. But that part of the tracks was really good. It worked really well. It was this part that was overgrown. Now, the other stage of resilience is you might go back and learn, and you might say, well, the longer, bigger term solution here is we need to fix these tracks instead of having buried. But they did what they could with their circumstances. So I thought it was a wonderful example of resilience.